So welcome everyone. I'm Gisela Turkiewicz from Brazilian Society of São Paulo, and I'll be the host of our IPA webinar from today. Good morning to all the colleagues in America. Good afternoon to those who, as Dr. Rui Aragão, are in Europe, and good evening to whom are in the Asia-Pacific region, as Dr. Soh Agatsuma. Welcome, everyone. I'm Gisela. I'm a clinical psychiatrist and psychoanalyst from Brazil, and I'm a member of the Brazilian Psychoanalytical Society of São Paulo. And nowadays, I serve as co-director of the Community and Culture Department at my society. I'll talk a little bit about our webinar structure. First, I'll introduce our guests, and then we will start with Dr. Soh Agatsuma presentations, and then Dr. Rui Aragão Oliveira presentation. After, we'll have the discussion between them and with the audience, with the question and answers section. Just remembering everyone that the only way to make questions is through the chat. All of you that are hearing and watching us can submit your questions from the question and answer section in the bottom Zoom bar. All the questions are anonymous, and I'll read the questions for them. And they will be able to discuss and answer mostly of them. If you need subtitles, they are available. You just need to click on the CC button here in Zoom screen. And once you enable it, you can customize section settings in your language and appearance by clicking the next button. Remember that the webinar is recorded, and then it will be uploaded in the IPA webpage and YouTube. Participants only can interact by the question and answer button. So all the microphones and cameras are off for this section, except for those of the panelists and mine. So let's start introducing Dr. Soh Agatsuma. Soh is based in Tokyo, he has lectured internationally on psychoanalytic technique, particularly on neutrality, countertransference, and culture. Dr. Agatsuma has been active contributor to IPA discussions and interregional exchanges, and is well known for his thoughtful and clinical grounded approach. He also participated in the IPA IRED project, translating into Japanese and focusing especially on the concept of Amae, the only entry that originated in Japan, which will also inform his contribution to this discussion. So, and then we are going to hear Dr. Rui Aragão Oliveira, who is a full member and supervising analyst of the Portuguese Psychoanalytical Society. He has a PhD in clinical psychology and taught in public and private universities. He is director of the training committee of the PPS, past president of the PPS, past editor-in-chief of the Portuguese Psychoanalytical Review, and past IPA editor of the PsychoanalysisToday.He. He teaches at the Psychoanalytical Institute of Lisbon and has been working with clinical groups IPA with the 3-level model. He has published on theory of technique, on paternal function, masculinity, and clinical issues. So we are going to start with Dr. Soh, and then we are going to pass to Dr. Rui. So you can start.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Gisela. And it is my great pleasure today to be here and to talk about neutrality. Now, let me share my slides. I made several slides. Okay, is everybody seeing it right? Okay. I'm going to read what I wrote down while going through the slides as well. In this presentation, I have two aims. The first one is to examine the concept of neutrality and to differentiate its two dimensions. The second is to discuss some cultural implications of the way neutrality is conceptualized and influenced. To address the first point, I refer to a paper that I wrote back in 2014, which was published in the International Forum of Psychoanalysis, titled Differentiating Two Kinds of Neutrality. Writing that paper served as an opportunity for me to organize my thoughts about neutrality. Quite a long time has passed since then, and I would like to revisit it today. Hearing that the theme of this New Year's EPF conference is neutrality, I have renewed my interest in this topic. My initial motivation for writing about neutrality arose from a long-standing sense of, I would say, some puzzlement during my training years. Although the neutrality concept was repeatedly discussed in multiple ways within our field, I think that the concept remained surprisingly complicated to grasp. During my analytic training, I was exposed to two orientations in psychoanalytic thinking. One is the traditional approach, and the other one is the interpersonal relational approach. Both are important for me and have continued to appeal to me to this day. After the initial encounter with the neutrality concept in the introductory phase of my training, the first definition I learned about in details was that of Anna Freud. As is very well known, she defined neutrality as the analyst's position of being, quote, equidistant from the id, the ego, and the superego. This made a lot of sense to me, since the analyst's task, as Freud understood, which I was following, was to analyze the patient's psychic life without any prejudice, without advocating for any one particular aspect of the patient's psychic life or the external life. Anna Freud's definition was later famously elaborated by Otto Kernberg, who introduced the term technical neutrality. He emphasized that this form of neutrality does not necessarily imply interpersonally detached attitude or emotional coldness on the part of the analyst. Rather, it concerns the technical stance that the analyst should adopt in the analytic situation so that the patient's inner life manifests itself with relative ease, and we could analyze it and eventually help the patient. This clarification also felt to me intuitively correct and very useful. At the same time, I was exposed to interpersonal relational and intersubjective approach. The interpersonal relational thinking emphasizes the significance of the immediacy of interpersonal interactions. From this perspective, neutrality can no longer be conceptualized in reference to the components of the psychic structure. Instead, it becomes something more fluid and dynamic. It was now conceived as something which revolves around tensions that arise when taking into account the patient's as well as the analyst's actual characteristics and the interactions between them. For example, J. Greenberg, as early as in 1986, conceptualized neutrality as the analyst's efforts to maintain an optimal tension, quote, an optimal tension between the patient's experience of us as old or new objects, end of quote. Other analysts in more or less similar persuasions also attempted to incorporate the analyst's actual involvement in the patient's object relations into their understanding of neutrality. Using the concept of enactment, Jody Davies, for example, defined neutrality as, quote, the capacity to move fluidly from one particular countertransference paradigm to another without becoming mired in the repetitive reenactment of any one configuration, end of quote. Note that both in Greenberg's and Davies' definition, the analyst's actual involvement in the patient's objective relational world is no longer prohibited. It is almost taken for granted that such involvement does occur, and what matters is now quality of involvement and its underlying dynamics. It is quite a departure from the traditional approach. In a similar vein, in self-psychology, Heinz Kohut in 1977 had redefined neutrality as, quote, the responsiveness to be expected on an average from persons, that is analysts, who have devoted their life to helping others with the aid of insights obtained via the analyst's empathic immersion into their inner life, end of quote, highlighting the analyst's participatory nature. Also later, self-psychologically informed intersubjectivists such as Robert Stolorow and Donna Orange, who are deeply influenced by Kohut, rejected neutrality almost altogether, arguing that the mind is never an isolated entity and emphasizing instead the co-constructed nature of the analytic relationship. I found these conceptualizations, while they are so different from Anna Freud's definition, still conceptually fascinating and clinically useful, especially when working with severely disturbed patients. However, I have to admit that the more I learned about these more contemporary conceptualizations of neutrality, the more puzzled I became. The same term seems to refer to very different, sometimes even contradictory ideas. I wondered why this was the case and felt compelled to try to formulate an explanation. My conclusion of a kind was that these divergent meanings could arise when we fail to pay adequate attention to distinguishing between two fundamentally different dimensions of neutrality. And these are, as I understand, operational neutrality and intentional neutrality. By operational neutrality, I mean this concerns the analyst's observable behavior, quote unquote behavior. By behavior, I mean not only behavior in the usual sense of the term, such as standing up or handing up the bills, but also any actions that have external manifestations, including verbal interventions and non-verbal expressions. By intentional neutrality, I refer to the analyst's aims, analytic attitude, and his or her intent, which exist, I would say, on a different theoretical plane from the behavior I just explained. The distinction implies, for example, that an analyst may behave in an operationally neutral manner while being intentionally non-neutral, or vice versa. Differentiating these two dimensions of neutrality is clinically important, I believe, in psychoanalysis, because it allows us to discuss the concept of neutrality with greater clarity, albeit simultaneously with greater complexity. This distinction also corresponds to a broader methodological question of how we regard psychoanalytic technique in general. This issue follows what Greenberg has described as two contrasting aspects of psychoanalytic theorizing, that is, the prescriptive and the descriptive aspects of theory. The analyst's intent to maintain neutrality is, of course, correlated with behaviorally observable manifestations. Yet, it is crucial to bear in mind that this relationship is not linear. The analyst's intent does not translate straightforwardly into operational behavior. This point connects with more recent discussions of enactment. Enactment can be said to refer to the analyst's inner state of mind, influencing the analytic situation in implicit, subtle ways beyond the analyst's awareness and outside of their control. Enactment theory therefore highlights the possibility that the analyst's analytic intent may emerge in unexpected forms due to the idiosyncratic elements on the part of the analyst. Then, what are the practical advantages of differentiating these two dimensions of neutrality? One benefit may be that it frees us from over-investing in thinking about whether any single behavior is neutral or not. We could now conceptually separate the analyst's intent from the external behavior of the analyst and consider each of its own terms. Now I would like to go to the next section, which is cultural implications of neutrality. And here I especially want to refer to the concept of Amae. As noted, by distinguishing operational neutrality from intentional neutrality, we are released from the question of whether neutrality has been achieved or not as an outcome to a significant degree, I hope. This becomes particularly important when considering cultural implications. To think about cultural influence to neutrality also helps understand the concept. To illustrate, I will introduce the concept of Amae, which many of you might already know. Amae is a commonly used Japanese word which was added to the psychoanalytic vocabulary by a Japanese psychoanalyst, Takeo Doi, in his book, The Anatomy of Dependence, written in 1971, translated into English 1973. Doi maintained that there is the desire to be loved or the need to be loved that are so commonly observed in Japanese social and clinical interactions, resulting in mutually dependent attitude, among the Japanese. Later, Doi argued further that amae refers both to the feeling of satisfaction that arises when one's desire to be loved is fulfilled and to the desire itself. I consider amae as the desire itself, that is, the desire to be loved, as the motivational amae. But the reach of amae can be broader than that. Salman Akhtar gave a very clear and concise definition of it. He described amae as a Japanese term which denotes an intermittent, recurring, culturally patterned interaction in which the ordinary rules of propriety and formality are suspended, allowing people to receive and give affectionate ego support to each other. It is noteworthy that amae can be understood both as a motivational concept and as a phenomenon co-created within the analytic field. Doi consistently framed amae as an intrapsychic concept, rendering it compatible with traditional psychoanalytic perspectives such as motivational theory and object relational thinking. Contemporary psychoanalysis increasingly tends to encompass both the intrapsychic, that is, motivation, wish, etc., and the interactional intersubjective dimensions of amae. This direction was, in fact, applied to amae concept long time ago by Yasuhiko Taketomo, a Japanese psychoanalyst and a contemporary of Doi, who trained in the US and practiced in New York. Taketomo proposed that amae can be conceptualized as an interactional phenomenon. He suggested that amae is best framed as the provision of an interactional context that permits, quote, a mutually agreed upon suspension of some ordinary restraints, end of quote. In a similar vein, Daniel Freeman expanded the concept, describing amae as, quote, interactive mutual regression in the service of the ego, which gratifies and fosters the progressive intrapsychic development of both participants, end of quote. Thus, the concept of amae includes both an intrapsychic dimension and an intersubjective interactional dimension. How, then, do these considerations connect neutrality with amae? I think that the interactional intersubjective dimension of amae influences the link between intent and external behavior for both analyst and patient. Even when the analyst holds inner intent to remain neutral, the interactional intersubjective dynamics of amae in the Japanese context, of the kind highlighted by Taketomo, may lead to, quote, a mutually agreed upon suspension of some ordinary restraint, end of quote, without the analyst's awareness. As a result, the analyst may become operationally non-neutral despite his or her intention to maintain neutrality. In other words, within the analytic field, amae continues to exert overt influence in shaping what is enacted and what is not, and eventually in how the analytic field manifests itself. I would like to refer to amae conceptualized in this way as indicative of the color, it's a metaphor of the analytic field. I imagine there must be many such colors of the analytic field in different cultures. The possibility of co-occurrence on both sides of the couch of an expectation that one's dependency needs will be accepted becomes significantly higher, like when the analyst and the patient shares the same cultural background, like Amae culture in Japan. When Amae is taking place in the analytic situation, that means in the analyst, in the patient, or in the analytic field itself, the analytic field becomes colored in the color of Amae. Then the mutual dependency occurring in the analytic interaction becomes much less visible by either party, because it is like trying to see an object of one color, let's say of green or yellow color, through a green or yellow lens. I think this may roughly correspond to what J. Greenberg, in his paper that discussed his concept of interactive matrix, written in 1995, meant when he said, if analyst and patient were concordant around the issue, there would have been nothing to interpret in this situation, end of quote. It might also correspond to what Michael Feldman in 1997, in his paper on projective identification and enactment, argued when he said that, quote, he, the analyst, may be unconsciously drawn to diminish them, meaning the anxieties and strain, by enacting a complex object relationship with a patient that initially serves to reassure both, end of quote. The determinant of the concordance between analyst and patient as described by Greenberg, and the motivation as well as the related characteristics of the enactment or projective identification of a complex object relationship described by Feldman may be traced back to what I call the color of the field. I argue that one such color is derived from Amae, although it is not the only one, of course. Consequently, the ways in which the analyst's intent translates into the analyst's external behavior become less predictable. In such circumstances, distinguishing the two dimensions of neutrality, as I introduced in this presentation, may prove particularly useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Soh. Now I'm going to open Dr. Rui's speech.
Okay. Well, hello everybody. I like to say that I'm very pleased to be here in the webinar with all of you and share my ideas and learn with all of you also. Well, first, let me tell you that a couple of years ago, I was invited by Joëlle Picard. At that time, she was the vice president of the EPF, in order to open the discussion of directors of training committee or directors of training meeting in one of the EPF conference about the subject neutrality in training analysis with my colleague from Greece, Fotis Bobos. So at that time we had a wonderful meeting with a lot of topics and comments, discussion and reflection. So since then, I have been working in the subject. So this talk will revisit the concept of neutrality, but in light of the particular conditions of a training analysis. So, and I will try to argue that neutrality cannot be understood outside the institutional field in some way. Let's take a look about the concept of neutrality. My colleague Soh already said very important things that in general, I completely agree. Maybe the first one is that the concept of neutrality has never been very clear in psychoanalysis. I think Freud's technical recommendations combined abstinence and restraint with a demand for sympathetic understanding. So neutrality was never equivalent to indifference, and rather, I think it was conceived as a safeguard against enactments or suggestions in therapy. Many other authors have highlighted along the time the ambiguity of neutrality, the concept. And some define it as equidistance from psychic agencies or conflicts, and others as a condition of openness and receptivity. And still others question its status as an ideal, arguing that analytical influence is inevitable and must be acknowledged rather than denied. I think if we look careful to our clinical settings, I think every interpretations we do as analysts, the interpretations in general are never neutral in a strict sense, because they already reflect theoretical commitments or clinical values, or even implicit models of what constitutes a good analysis or a good analyst for ourselves. So these debates acquire particular relevance, I think, in the conditions of a training analysis. Because in training contexts, such implications are quite amplified, as interpretations may be unconsciously here as judgments about professional suitability or analytical competence. So neutrality, therefore, cannot be reduced, as my colleague said, cannot be reduced to a behavioral stance. I think it refers instead to the analyst's capacity to recognize and work through their own desires, identifications, or anxieties, and particularly those mobilized by institutional belonging and responsibility. And just to take a short look for the biography from the last decades, I would like to, for example, to mention Stone in the 60s spoke about the benevolent neutrality, but Kernberg in the 70s spoke about technical neutrality. But in the 90s, Rennick, for example, in a more radical way, stated that he does not think neutrality is an ideal to which it is useful for an analyst to strive, and therefore did not recommend it at all, neutrality, which he associated at that time with inactivity. Well, in the 90s also, a more classical paper, frankly, referred to an essential neutrality, a position in which there is an absence of decided views and capable of maintaining the exploratory attitude and the promotion of discovery. So in this sense, neutrality, I think, can be important as a way of facilitating the investigation of unconscious process. I think it is a condition for not letting ourselves be blind by our own desires or by the theoretical perspectives we believe in and which can influence all of us. So neutrality in the face of pressure or conflicts interests promoted by different psychic instincts, or even neutrality in the face of possible consequences or outcomes, I think they are quite different from what, for example, others called neutrality with regard to transference, which seems to be essential in the analytical process. It implies that the analyst must be able to allow himself to be lived through intensely by the patient without counter-reacting complementarily and without allowing himself to be confused. So analytical neutrality has really a function, which is to protect the patient's freedom of expression and to reinforce attention to the patient's understanding. So neutrality is not about adaptive actions or solution. I think rather it refers to attitudes toward the patient's subjective experience that enable and facilitate the patient's transferential process. Now let's see what happens about neutrality and the training analysis. I think the unique institutional context of training analysis introduces significant challenge toward the analytic neutrality, to the countertransference, and the internal boundaries of the analyst. As you know, the dual rule of the training analyst as both a therapeutic guide and also an institutional gatekeeper. I think this condition creates a unique set of ethical and technical challenge. Unlike standard analysis, the training analysis involves implicit and sometimes explicit expectation. The analysand is not only a patient, but it is also a future colleague, and their suitability for analytical work often becomes a latent or over focus of the treatment. So this dual function strains the traditional analytic framework, which depends on the analyst's abstinence for both action and intention. I think this configuration intensifies transference and countertransference phenomena. So idealization, rivalry, submission, and demands for recognition are not incidental, but structurally facilitated in this way. The risk is not simply that neutrality is lost, but that it becomes idealized as a defensive fiction, obscuring the analyst implication in institutional dynamics. I like to remember, for example, our colleague from German, Angelika Steil, some years ago, introduces the concept of the institutional third to describe the triangulating effect of institutional dynamics on the analytical diet. This concept is particularly relevant, I think, in training analysis, where the institution functions as a silent but yet pervasive influence, subtly shaping countertransference and affecting the analytical stance and the supposed neutrality. Because when the patient becomes a candidate, or even before, when the patient expresses their desire to apply for analytical training, the intrusion of a third figure into the analytical process is inevitable. So the institutional group actualizes different modalities of the psychism of both patient and analyst. The René Cailles has called it the share space, and it's a concept corresponds to a parts played by each of the intervening parties. And even if not act out or even verbalize, the unconscious aliens are formations established in the intrapsychic of both patient and analyst, mobilizing a fantasy that it is silently shared. So in this context, the common psychic dimension, which unites both elements of the analytical pair, are fantasies, identifications, ideals, illusions, and unconscious aliens. We all know that to know how to meet the other and respecting the otherness of his story and private subjectivity is, of course, a greater challenge, which requires a consistent limitation of internal structures and the capacity to analyze the countertransference. The analysis of a candidate, having a third party involved in mind of the analytical pair, I think it poses different challenge and demands to the analysts with didactic duties, and particularly to the supposed neutrality. So the circumstance of training analysis improves the actualization of the transgenerational process of psychic transmission, where the analyst is faced with a complex ethical question of trying to be loyal to the clinical objective and of course, do the analysis to the patient, but alongside trying to be loyal to the psychoanalytical institution that he also represents and defending the quality of the training. We should remember that when the patient became a candidate, the analytical process and also the analysts are under appraisal, which gives rise to the activation of the functioning of Bion's basic assumptions in the group of the analytical pair. For example, Samuel Ehrlich and Mirla Ehrlich-Ginor a few years ago warned that the manifestations of this functioning often appears only later in institutional meetings, in personal or unofficial or informal conversations, and almost always in a very discreet but undeniable way. So the candidates, of course, they bring their curiosity and eagerness to learn with practical questions and uncertainties. And they feel the need to find objects with which they can identify with, to assure them internally, which they can imitate or idealize or even protect them from deception. And these are usually intense, effective processes directed toward the institutes, to the trainers, to the supervisors, and of course, also toward their analysts. So after admission, the regulation of many societies here, as we all know, usually state that the analyst must maintain neutrality and impartiality. However, there are practically no studies on the psychoanalytical understanding of the issues raised by this aspect. Although some of the dilemmas are identified when former analysts and patients face each other when they meet as colleagues after the training is over. Most of our knowledge, as our Levin reminded us a few years ago also, most of our knowledge about that has been speculative and anecdotal, subject to the limitations of self-reporting. Well, initially it was thought that extreme neutrality and abstinence of its own sake placed the analysts in a position free from interference of their own desires. However, the long story of boundary violations and possible gratifications of the analyst has become a difficult but an urgent topic. It is one that indicates that something else is potentially present and somehow related to the analyst's own unconscious life and internal boundaries. Louise Durtubey, for example, also points out how we can succumb to a seduction of a narcissistic order that comes, above all, from our analysts, from our ego ideal, and from our feelings of omnipotence as analysts, of becoming in love with ourselves, of feeling that we are the only one, the only analysts, a privileged one, the ones who can provide a cure or guarantee a professional progress to the candidate. So in these circumstances, we easily underestimate difficulties and limitations. We are dazzled by the light which we think emanates from us, and making us blind to the patient and to the analytical field. I think the structuring of the analyst's internal setting, which presupposes the interiorization of ethical rules, produces a context which should be at the service of the analytical pair, and establishing fundamental and organizing boundaries, but also avoiding obsessive rigidness of a defensive nature, which may turn analysis into an as-if process. We are all vulnerable to a disturbance of our analytical function, and sometimes the verdict of colleagues of our patients, their opinion in training, and comments from supervisors can easily trigger unexpected persecutory reactions into the analytical process. And these are the circumstances that most often manifest the presence of these problems inherent in institutional dynamics, fraternal rivalries, and the internal boundaries of psychoanalysts. I think we all are in a kind of investigators of our own psychic process, and researchers of what patients transmit to us. As Manuela Triller said in a podcast about the convulsions on Psychoanalytical Institute some years ago. And I think we should be able to learn with our patients. So the high intensity of the analytical situation exposes both parties, patient and psychoanalyst, to a very primitive vulnerabilities in a process that leads to the revival of infantile sexuality, compromising constructive elements, but also high and complex destructiveness. There are narcissistic parts of analysts that can take over the therapeutic process. Destructive drive contents can lead them to consider the patient as their child in order to understand them better and to want to help them resolve their conflicts, and that they may be successful in their external life and in their profession. I think the institution can and must be there to help, and to help both patient and analyst to notice, to understand, and to transform the complexity of unconscious dynamics. I think in the space of intersubjective, the institution is also present as an object of fantasy, which we can point out to the question posed to both the analyst and the patient or the candidate. It is, what does the institution want from me or from us? I think it's important not to underestimate the role of the institution, since it can itself contribute to pathological factors and lead to confusion or even acting out. Now, to conclude, some words about supporting neutrality and the institutional and clinical perspective. I think the maintenance of neutrality in training analysis cannot reasonably be conceived as the result of individual technique discipline alone. While personal reflexivity and ethical commitments are indispensable, they are not enough to sustain neutrality in the complex relational field of analytical work, and particularly in training contexts, where asymmetries of power, identification, and idealization are structurally intensified. Neutrality must therefore be understood as a relational and institutional achievement, supported by reflective structures that can introduce triangulation into clinical thinking and practice. So in this regard, I would like to record Ricardo Bernardi's contribution on triangulation, clinical evidence, and contextualization offer a particular fertile conceptual orientation. Bernardi has argued that psychoanalytical knowledge acquires epistemic robustness when it is subject to triangulation. That is, when clinical meanings are examined from multiple vantage points across different theoretical perspectives, clinical settings, and observational levels. This epistemological stance challenges both the notion of the analyst as a privileged observer and the idea that clinical truth can be grounded solely in the immediacy of the analytical diet. So applied to the question of neutrality, triangulation function as a counterweight. In training analysis especially, the analyst-analyst relationship is exposed to intensify transferential pressures that may blur boundaries between analytical function, pedagogical influence, and institutional authority. Neutrality, in this sense, is not simply a matter of abstaining from suggestion or maintaining interpretative restraint. I think it requires an ongoing capacity to situate one's clinical experience within a wider field of reflection. So supervision, peer discussion, theoretical plurality, and institutional cultures that value critical dialogue all serve as essential triangulating structures that help preserve analytical openness. In fact, it seems important to have a second look, like the Bellinger said, in order to be able to flow the spontaneous association, there are many ways to open multiple perspectives or vertices that may help to understand the process in a deeper way. I think from a clinical standpoint, neutrality emerges less as a static position than as a dynamic regulatory process. The analyst's capacity to remain open to multiple meanings, to tolerate uncertainty, and to revise hypotheses in light of new material depends on the availability of internalized and external triangulating perspectives. Bernardis emphasize on methodological pluralism underscores that neutrality is compromised not only by overt enactments, but also by unexamined theoretical dogmatism. I think institutionally, this perspective has important implications for psychoanalytical training organizations, structures that promote dialogue across schools of thought, encourage research literacy, and integrate empirical and clinical forms of evidence can contribute indirectly but decisively to the maintenance of neutrality in analytical practice. To conclude, I think we need to highlight neutrality as an emergent property of reflective system rather than an individual moral achievement. Seen in this slide, supporting neutrality becomes a shared responsibility. Such an understanding not only deepens the conceptualization of neutrality, but also aligns it with contemporary epistemological and ethical demands within psychoanalysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Rui. Thank you, Soh and Rui, for both your presentations. I think both of them have shown us how neutrality is a concept that is so important, as controversial and difficult to achieve in our practice, demanding a constant effort from us, not only in practice, but also theoretically. I was thinking, hearing both of you, that if we could get a common line between the presentations, we should think that neutrality is an ethical attitude, regarding, if you could summarize it in few words. So before we start with questions and answers, I would like to know if both of you have questions to each other, or maybe some comment on the other presentation. You can take the speech.
Maybe I can start first. Thank you very much, Rui, for your wonderful presentation. I really, I try not to read your materials too much beforehand, so that my own thinking is not going to be affected too much. But I just only to find out that a lot of what I said in my paper really has something in common with your presentation. I think your point of view of institutional setting, the significance of the institutional setting in relation to neutrality is something has some elements in common with my idea, which is like a cultural element, as exemplified by Amae, for example, has significance. How we think about neutrality. And I also agree that there are different ways of conceptualizing neutrality, but the traditional one is, I think, not only the traditional stance, but also you mentioned the triangulation and intersubjectivity. Those contemporary ideas, I think, are now becoming more and more important. That's something I really feel the same way as Rui described. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think we are in a complementary way, even if the talks are quite different. I think we share more or less the same concept about neutrality. I really think so, because you mentioned in your talk about the importance of the attitude, and we can face the attitude in many different ways. And it is not about behavior or to control something, but it is more an attitude about trying to find out, to stimulate the development and openness and research. It's more about intention than control or behavior. I completely agree with you. One thing that I was listening to Soh talk, and I was assumed that the importance of the issue of the translation and culture in psychoanalysis, and the importance of that, because we both didn't talk about that, but it is very clear that it is something that was at the beginning when the psychoanalysts began to discuss the neutrality, the concept. It was very clear that it seems like Freud never used really the word neutrality, because in the first moment I think it was Joan Rivière who translate that into the word in German, that I can't speak German, but Joan Rivière first translated it to indifference and not neutrality, and it was only later that Strachey used the term neutrality in the translation. So I think the meaning and the importance of this kind of subject issues on translation, and also the influence of the culture, as so told, is quite important in psychoanalysis.
Thank you, Rui. We have a question from a colleague. The first one is for Rui, quoting, "Is Mark Solms' new book, The Only Cure, an example of a defense of psychoanalysis or narcissistic grandiosity? How do you establish triangulation that is independent of the institutional superego when trying to establish a frame or process of neutrality?" Did you understand? You must turn on your mic.
Yes, I understood, but do you mind to repeat the second one?
The second part, yeah, because there are two questions in one. How do you establish triangulation that is independent of the institutional superego when trying to establish a frame or process of neutrality?
Okay. Well, I think first that we should differentiate the institution from the institutional superego. You know, it's quite different, I think, when you look, for example, for the candidates, or even for ourselves, the fantasies that we all have about the institutional, or about the society, and about the local ones, are completely different. You know, so I think it's very important for the analyst to be aware about his own fantasies about that, and to differentiate in the reality and the fantasy. One thing that I think it can help in order to be aware of that, for example, is when you go abroad, or when you have meetings with different people, with different colleagues from different societies. I think the international field helps you a lot in order to be more aware and to look to yourself and to your analytical process in a very different way. introduces the triangulation factor or function, as you may call. About the book of Psalms, I have no answer for that because I know Psalms, but I need to maybe to read the book first, which I didn't. Okay, maybe Soh can say something, of course.
So, would you like to contribute to something?
Well, I wish I could, but I don't think I have much to add. So.
Okay. The next question is in the same field of the first one, maybe a continuation of yours of what we were talking. That's it. Would you? I would love to hear you both discuss culture and neutrality. Does neutrality look the same in Japan, Portugal, and elsewhere? Does neutrality look the same in last century or 2006 or now 2026?
Well, I think it the essence of neutrality probably stays quite the same, almost the same, regardless where we are. And even I don't know much about the future, but I don't think the concept has the essence has changed so drastically comparing 2006 and 2026. But how it the appearance, I think, varies. I think the essence of neutrality concerns, as Rui suggested, also it's the inner ability to sort of stand in the third position and to be able to be reflective. And the understanding of neutrality has changed from what is observable to the inner state of the analyst's mind and his or her willingness to really reflect on themselves, even when externally things seem to be going smoothly. So in that sense, I think the essence has remained, and I think is quite the same. But for example, where mutual dependence, for example, is encouraged or taken for granted, as the case in Japan, sometimes not always, it becomes more difficult to really discern whether, for example, kind of acceptance of patient's dependency need is neutral or not. As I said in my presentation, I think it becomes almost invisible. But as I said, the essence being with the analyst willingness to look further, even when things are on the surface going smoothly. I think at the end we should be able to. The analyst is expected to really figure out whether the dependency needs has some like a pathological significance, or whether it is just a part of cultural expectations, culturally expected attitude. But so simply put, I think the essence remains the same, although technically speaking, I think it requires different approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Rui?
Yeah. Yes, I think in general, I have more or less the same idea, because I think it remains more or less the same, the concept, but we should look at him, should be understood inside the cultural field. where it can express. So maybe the concept is more or less the same, yeah. But the ways you have in order to access, or the ways you have to take a look to the expression of the neutrality can change, of course. I think maybe the main topic is to use the neutrality, and at least is the way I saw and the way I understand that Freud probably was looking for neutrality too, is an achievement in order to protect the analytical function. So it's more about attitude and using the neutrality for being open to receptiveness and not for acting, or not to exert the analytical function. That is, well, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's good. I agree with both of you.
Okay.
We can go through. So the next question is, can you talk more about abstinence and anonymity, whether they are practiced today or are still relevant, especially in relation to our discussion of therapeutic neutrality?
Well, my sense is that first of all, this is this is a not very easy question to answer, but the concept of abstinence, I think is very valid. I think, well, it's related to neutrality as well. But no, I don't. It's the same as about the case of neutrality. It's we might be tempted to, we might end up fulfilling some of the patient's needs. For example, such as in the case of dependency need, if we take abstinence principle in a very strict sense, we should not be satisfying the patient's dependency need. But the neutrality concept, at least the contemporary understanding of it, as I described, is not so much about whether or not you satisfy the patient's needs, but about to reflect upon the situation of what it means by satisfying the patient's needs, and also to be flexible as to whether or not to stay in that particular relational configuration. And anonymity-wise, about the anonymity, I think it's very, nowadays, there have been many discussions as to whether anonymity is possible. I can only say that there are good discussions about, self-disclosure and / self-revelations. It is often not a very good idea. I tell my supervisors very often that, if you are in doubt, don't disclose too much about yourself. But however, keep in mind that a lot of things about you are being expressed anyway. So, we have to bear in mind that patients are seeing us very carefully, and so we are not so anonymous. However, revealing intentionally how we are is a totally different thing. So we have to be very careful about that. That's what I thought about.
Well, I just want to add that I think we are talking about or discussing about the meta psychological concepts. So we are almost working in the human limits, in order to be abstinence or anonymity. Okay, I think we should try to be careful on that, but in the limits of the human being, I think it's impossible in order to be completely neutral or completely abstinent. It's impossible. I think we are not so far away from, for example, the well-known papers on Bion, about having no memory, no desire, and no understanding. Because in a way, it's impossible because it's a condition of human being. But in order to exercise your analytical function, you have to be close to that and to have conditions to feel uncertainty and to tolerate not to understand. But in a way, we are in the limits of the human being. It's completely unreasonable to think that we can have no memory or no desire, but we should work on that. That's my understanding, of course.
Do you think, Rui, that neutrality or non-desire is a status that we are constantly looking for more than a status that we achieve itself?
Yeah, exactly.
We can say that, no?
Yes. In a way, we can say that in an unconscious, the unconscious probably has no neutrality.
Yeah.
So we have to look
it's always us who are there with the patient, even if they don't know nothing about our personal lives.
Yeah. I agree. Yes.
Okay. Let's go to the next one. What do you think that are the biggest challenges in terms of neutrality for initial practitioners nowadays?
Well, I think first of all, in the very initial phase, the beginner practitioners might end up easily taking sides as to, let's say, whether the patient should do certain things or not, and the beginning practitioners may be tempted to give kind of direct advice, but that's the beginning. But then the next difficulty might be related to be kind of too stiff in one's attitude, as if they have, the practitioners might think that they cannot ever express any kind of opinion and maybe stay under pressure all the time, not to let it out. That might appear from the patient's perspective that the analyst in training might be struggling internally with some impulse. I think that is not what is meant by being neutral. I think being neutral means, as we've been discussed in this seminar, it's an internal rather flexibility, I think, to try to be flexible in terms of multiple possible views. So initially, the practitioners, to summarize, maybe too relaxed at the beginning and too rigid in the next stage. But in the end, I think it'll be good if we could be reasonably relaxed and flexible, but not too much. That's how I see it.
Well, I see it in relation with one of the first questions about the institutional superego, because when you begin, it's impossible not to have any kind of institutional superego inside your mind. And also because I think it's also related with your own idealizations about what it is to be a psychoanalyst. And so we need some time and some clinical experience in order to be neutral to this kind of movements inside of us. Let me tell you, just to share. Yesterday night, I was in a scientific meeting in my society, and several colleagues talk about the difference and the evolution that you need some time in order not to be so active with your patients and not to talk so much. And it took some time in order to be more like an analyst. And but I was thinking about to myself that, well, yes, I may speak less, but probably what's going on in my mind, I'm much more active inside of me with many thoughts than I had in the beginning. And so in order to have neutrality inside yourself, in order to take care about your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own hypotheses that you are listening, you need some space, some time in order to organize and to lead with them.
Yes. I was thinking about training analysis also, that this third that the institutions represents for all the candidates, all of us, ideally should be included in the training analysis. Is something that should be treated with the analyst, between the analyst and the analyst and the candidates, to in search of this analytic attitude that we are always constructing.
Just to tell you that my thoughts on that is that probably I think we need more to be more careful when we became training analysts, because you see the institutional superego changed a lot when we become the training analyst and a senior member, and I think it's very easy to act out something, probably not in a verbalization, but outside the field.
Yeah.
And I think we should be more aware of that when you become a training analyst. Yeah, because it's a difficult subject, I think.
Yeah, we as you say, we must always have the second look, like the Baranger has taught us.
Yeah.
Because the institution, we are the institution, the people of the institution are so we have this position even if we talk about it or not. So it's better to treat when it's better to talk about it in the analysis, I think.
Yes, I agree completely. Yeah.
So we have more questions here. This one is specifically for Soh. Doesn't mutual dependence in Japan compromise neutrality? Is the analyst really dependent on the patient in the way that dependence occurs in social non-clinical relationships?
Yes, thank you. This is exactly actually what I wanted to explain. If we consider neutrality as something like externally observable things, the answer to this question is yes. I mean, in Japan, neutrality becomes impossible because there is a strong tendency toward allowing mutual dependency to happen. However, that's like the baseline setup of the analytic setting. Although I want to also add that it really depends on the analytic diet. Not every analytic diet in Japan allows for mutual dependency because it's a kind of it's a generalized idea. But anyway, but if we conceptualize neutrality, not so much about with the external parameters, but internal state of mind and the analyst's willingness to explore multiple possibilities, I think the concept of neutrality stays very valid in Japan and I guess probably in every culture and in the future also, in the contemporary world as well as in the future. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Now for both of you, what can the concept of neutrality contribute to international relations and negotiations?
This is a very difficult one.
Yeah.
Difficult one to answer. Let me say, I kind of really allude to like a real international state of affairs. It's not something I have much to I have specialty about, but I would say to reflect on oneself and the willingness to explore where we are. And I think regardless, socially or individually, I think it's something useful. Maybe that's where neutrality may be useful in thinking about those issues.
Well, I'm not sure if the colleague who did this question was thinking about the international relationships between psychoanalysts or the international relationships in the politics in general, in geopolitical field. But my mind was on that, and I believe maybe he was thinking on both. And I think neutrality is a very actual and present issue, and very, very important to have any kind of conditions or tools, whatever they are, in order to have a point of view that help us and to see in a neutrality way. I think it's a helpful tool in order to realize and to learn about ourselves and about what we are we doing, or what are we moving or trying to work on, to work out with someone. So in a not only in the psychoanalytical field, but also in the political, in general political, in the world political field, I think it's quite important to have some kind of condition in order to make people learn and develop in some way and find new solutions, for sure.
Another one, I think we are going to make it, we have 5 minutes, so let's answer this one, and then I would like you to say a few words to close our meeting today, okay?
Okay.
How can analysts hold a position of neutrality while being inevitably embedded in a conflictual and morally complex reality.
Yeah, I think in a similar vein, as I answered to previous questions, I think it's not so much about how we think about real issues, because there are so many ways to understand real issues, and a lot of which may be beyond our comprehension. But it's not so much about finding answers to each external issues and try to find neutral way of relating, but about our willingness, trained willingness, and curiosity about what it means that, let's say, I think this and that way, as opposed to his or her way. And I think, to be committed to think about the process of negotiation, maybe what makes analysts analysts. Thank you.
I think neutrality is a tool in order to help us to have conditions to think under fire or under the chaos or something like that. You have to be a little bit distant and can be indifference, the concept used in fact by Freud, indifference, in order to have conditions to look for what happened, and especially about to protect you from the narcissistic issue that you may have. And I think it's a quite important thing in your clinic. Usually when we talk about the countertransference, and to be careful about that and to use it as a tool, I think it's much more related also with narcissistic issues, that they are quite difficult and interfere with your clinical practice very easily.
Okay. We have lots of questions, but we won't be able to answer all of them. I would like to thank all the participants who sent their contributions. And I'm sorry for that, for not being able to talk about all of your questions. I'd like to thank again Soh and Rui for your presentations. They were very inspiring. And I'd like to thank the organization for the invitation of being here today. And I'll let Rui and Soh speak a little bit, so then we can close the meeting today.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciated all the questions raised, and a lot of them stimulating, and I learned a great deal myself. Thank you.
Thank you also, and it was really a great pleasure, and I appreciate very much the questions and all the ambience of the organization of the webinar. It's a great opportunity to learn with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for all, and have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.